Hello, and welcome to episode 22 of Intercultural Insiders. My name is John McGraw, and I help newcomers and expats connect across cultures to succeed in less time and pain. I am the founder of Hyaku Coaching, which is dedicated to helping you create your pathway to success in a new culture. The purpose of Intercultural Insiders is to share the stories of people with intercultural experiences. So if you're feeling isolated or lost, you can hear something from the guests' experiences that could help you, even if it's just a reminder that you're not alone. And today, our guest is Sachi Kikuchi, who is a translator, language instructor, and CEO of Kokoro Communications, which specializes in Japanese and English language services, including training and translation. And throughout the episode, I'll be showing a link. If you want to find out more about Kokoro Communications, you can just click on or scan this QR code to find out more about the services that Kokoro Communications offers. So getting back to talking about our guest today, Sachi. So obviously, as you know, I have an interest in Japanese culture, having lived in Japan for several years, and the name of my business, Hyaku Coaching, comes from Japanese, hyaku, being Japanese for a great leap forward, whether that's literally or in terms of progress. So Sachi comes from a bicultural, biracial, and bilingual background. She has a Japanese father and Canadian mother, and she was born and raised in Canada. So, in the next part two, which will be next week, we'll talk more and focus more on her work. But today, we're going to be talking more about her bicultural experiences. And I mentioned last week that I felt that this episode in particular would be of interest to anyone who is raising children in Canada after moving in from another country, whether they're born here in Canada or at a young age, or anyone who really has been struggling with identity, a sense of identity, because Sachi really gets into that today. So specifically, she talks about growing up in a bicultural environment in Canada, her experiences working in Japan, and establishing her sense of identity in Canada and Japan. So, because of those different topics, again, as I mentioned, I think that this will be of particular interest for anyone who is raising a family here in Canada or in a different culture than where they were raised. As always, this interview is pre-recorded, but Sachi is live in the chat. So please feel free to ask questions and comment during the interview. You can ask questions to myself or to Sachi. She will be quite happy to answer in the chat. I find that when there is a lively chat, it does make the experience of watching the show much more valuable and interesting because a lot of great information can come up. And I've also seen in past episodes connections being made and opportunities resulting from networking by chatting with the people that you connect with in the chat for this event. So take full advantage of it. Please do listen and watch and enjoy, but take full advantage of the interactive experience. And if you are watching this pre-recorded, of course, then you can take advantage and view all of the comments and other interesting tidbits that come up through the discussion, as well as the links to Kokoro Communications and Hyaku Coaching. So, without further wait, let's get into part one of the interview with Sachi Kikuchi. Sachi, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Sure. Thanks so much, John, for having me on today. My full name is Catherine Sachi Kikuchi. I do prefer Sachi, so please call me that. I was born and raised in Toronto in Canada. My father is Japanese. My mother is Canadian. I grew up in a bilingual, biracial, and bicultural household, speaking both languages my entire life. I went to English school Monday to Friday as a child, Japanese school on Saturdays. After I finished a master's in in linguistics, I moved to Japan and lived in Sendai City in Miyagi Prefecture for about 4 years, mostly teaching English, doing some translation on the side. I moved back to Toronto. That was almost 6 years ago now. And today I am a Japanese teacher, a translator, and the CEO of Kokoro Communications. I also co-founded a company called Japanese for Nikkei with a longtime friend of mine, in which I serve as a Japanese teacher and CTO. Thanks so much for having me here. It's lovely to be here to chat with you.
Yes, you mentioned that you started this corporation for teaching Japanese to Nikkei. And could you explain that term Nikkei?
Of course, yeah. The sort of general term for Nikkei is people who have Japanese ancestry. At Japanese for Nikkei, we do have a slightly different and more inclusive definition, which you can find on the website. But basically, Nikkei as a broad term used generally in society refers to people of Japanese ancestry who don't necessarily live in Japan today.
Thank you very much for that explanation. Being raised in a bicultural home, was there a point where you realized that your family was maybe quite unique as compared to the other people that you knew in your neighborhood?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think I probably noticed it as soon as I started English school. So a lot of my friends and classmates at Japanese school had sort of similar tendencies at home, even though at the time when I was a small child, most of my classmates had both parents who were born and raised in Japan, who were now living in Canada. In my case, I had one parent from Japan. But I do think it was probably around the time I started English school, which for me was senior kindergarten. So it would have been around then, maybe when I was about 5 or 6. I noticed that things were different.
Once you realized that, what sort of things stood out for you?
There are probably a lot of things, many of which I have likely forgotten. But one of the big things I do still remember today was the reaction to the food that I brought for lunches from other people. So the elementary school I went to was not the most diverse of places at the time, at least. And I love Japanese food. I grew up with it. My dad is a really good cook. And so we'd have soba or udon, all these different very at-home type food that I initially was really happy to take to school for lunch. But at the time, of course, Japanese food wasn't as well known. It wasn't as prevalent. It wasn't as popular as it is today. So I did get a lot of weird looks and negative comments. And so there were times when I would hide my food and eat, or I would not eat my lunches at all, which unfortunately would disappoint my mother, which I definitely don't blame her for. But that's probably one of the main things I remember. I think there were also a few other things relating to fashion and language use, of course. But I have also heard that other, not necessarily East Asian immigrants have had similar difficulties when it's come to food, especially as children.
I can appreciate how difficult that might have been as a child. Maybe there was a point when you started to think of it in a more positive way, the advantages that you had from being raised in a bicultural home.
I think it probably began to get easier in middle school. But I did feel significantly more accepted and understood when I got into high school. And my high school had a lot more East Asians. There were very few Japanese people in my grade. But I did have a lot more friends who had East Asian background. And so even if not everything was the same, they were much more likely to understand where I came from and my perspectives and things like that. So that was when it felt easier. But I guess it wasn't until I was an adult that, or maybe nearing adulthood, that I really felt as though there were bonuses outside of the home and outside of my own immediate personal life to being bicultural and bilingual. But my parents have been great in terms of ensuring that my siblings and I felt very connected and very proud of our Japanese heritage, and also to friends and family who are still there. So I was always to be who I was or have the connections that I do, but it was more understanding and appreciating it within the wider Toronto or wider Canadian society here.
It sounds like your parents had a huge and a very positive influence. What things stood out for you when you reflect back on these values that your parents instilled in you?
There are a lot of things, I guess, that I think about and appreciate significantly more now, and especially appreciate the challenges that they must have gone through. One big thing that I notice now that I have a lot of friends and former classmates who are raising children is the difficulty or the challenges, perhaps, of raising multilingual children. There are some people who feel very strongly that children should focus on one language, or they should learn one language first and then other languages after. There are other people who think that teaching as many languages as possible, as early as possible, is good. And just seeing that even though people may have one specific belief over the other, once you start thinking about how that works within the family dynamics or the values or the connections to other cultures and societies outside of where the home is, the challenges of parents working full-time jobs or not necessarily having a lot of access to whether it's picture books or videos or whatever input of the non-dominant language, I do really appreciate the amount of effort that my parents went to and the degree to which they ensured that my siblings and I had a good grasp on both Japanese and English. And I think that helped me, at least, continuously want to maintain and improve my Japanese, even if I was only really ever in Toronto for most of my childhood.
It's quite impressive that you're able to develop your Japanese ability because of how you were raised. Getting into adulthood and going into the translation work and teaching English and Japanese, what was your pathway into that journey?
It started off probably about around the time that my memory starts. Most of my father's side of the family is not very proficient in English, and most of my mother's side of the family is not particularly, if at all, proficient in Japanese. And as the first child within the household, I was tasked, I guess you could say, to do a lot of interpreting. So my siblings, of course, also helped once they came along, and my parents did what they could when necessary, and I guess when it was helpful to do so. But I do remember spending a lot of my childhood interpreting for one person or another, whether it was people visiting or my father's friends or neighbors who had just moved from Japan to Canada. So interpreting was very normal, very natural to me. My father has been a translator my whole life, so I watched how that was a viable career option. If my dad can do it, then other people could do it too, with how I saw it. And then my mother has been an ESL teacher for about as long as I can remember. So I grew up seeing these role models who were able to use language to have an income and to live everyday lives without necessarily having to go to an office or have a 9-to-5 job. And I think for me, that's probably where most of it started out. I first learned about linguistics when I was about 12 years old. A family friend who was Japanese had a daughter who was a number of years older than myself, and she had studied theoretical linguistics in her first year in university and told me about this class when I was about 12, when my family was visiting their family's home. And she gave me the textbook for her first year class. And at that point, I decided I was going to study linguistics in university. And I did waver a little bit at one point, but that's what I ended up doing. And I really enjoyed it. So I went to my master's, and I still toy with the idea of doing a PhD in linguistics at some point, although I don't know if I'll actually go through with that. And then around the time I was in my early to mid 20s, I decided I had enough of Canada. I wanted to live in Japan. The easiest way to do that was for me to get a job as an English teacher. So I got my TESL certificate in Toronto before I left, and went and taught English in Japan for about 4 years and did translation jobs on the side. I think I started getting paid for translation when I was about 18 or 19 years old. But it wasn't until toward the end of my stay in Japan, I think, that I seriously started thinking about doing it long term. And then I realized how passionate I was, specifically for certain topics of translation. And that's what I've been doing ever since. I don't remember exactly when it was, but a number of years ago, maybe about 4 years ago, I was asked if I would be interested in teaching Japanese. And so I tested out the waters there, and I've been doing it ever since.
And I definitely want to talk more about your teaching and translation. Just going back a little bit, assume when you went as an adult to teach English, that wasn't your first time visiting Japan?
Yes, that's correct. It was not my first time. As part of our Japanese language education, keeping in touch with family and friends in Japan, my parents had taken my siblings and I to Japan probably every 2 2 or 3 years in the summer. So it was the first time I lived there, but it was definitely not the first time I had visited.
And how was it then going there as a child, going there for summers, and then living there as an adult teaching English?
It was very different. I know that I have spoken to others who have had similar experiences, and I think there are similarities again, but there are also some very large differences between each of our perspectives. So anything that I share now is very much my own experience and not necessarily the experience of others. But for me, as a child visiting with my family, I was acutely aware that I didn't look like everyone else. And so I knew when people were talking about my siblings and I, or my family and I, understood what they were saying, but it was assumed that I didn't. And so there was a time, maybe, I don't know, just before I became a teenager, when I enjoyed making a comment back, like saying thanks, or I understand you, to people who would be talking about us in front of us. And I took joy in seeing their surprised faces. But overall, I very much enjoyed visiting Japan, being with my family there. But as an adult, it was very different because not only was I living there, but I had to work, which meant interacting with the culture in a different way as compared to when you're there for a short amount of time, just traveling. And even though I was grateful that I went, and I still very much value the time I spent there and all the people that I met, there was a time that I had a little bit of a love-hate relationship with Japanese society. I still really enjoy going there even today, but yeah, there were certain things about being, so-called hafu that created a few challenges.
That term is what's commonly used for people who are biracial, specifically being Japanese and of another ethnicity.
Yeah. The second ethnicity tends to be Caucasian or white. That's a general label for hafu. But of course, anybody can be any type of mix. So there still is a little bit of an assumption of what the definition of hafu is. And it is used more commonly in Japan than any other label. But Japanese people, or those of us who might be labeled as hafu in Japan, sometimes have different preferences for labels, whether it's daburu or mikusu or something else.
It sounds like it's changing a bit.
I think so. I think it's about time.
I was in Japan for several years, but obviously not having any Japanese in my ancestry. And then, of course, my wife, both of her parents were Japanese, but being of another culture, even though she was fluent in the language. So I'm curious about your experience as someone who, again, is fluent in the language and is of two cultures and of two races. What else could you say about that experience?
I feel like there are a lot of different things I could say. I think for me, my experience personally was that when I moved there, and for a lot of my life, I have wanted to appear more Japanese. I have wanted to be more accepted as being Japanese. I have been told by many people throughout my life that I don't necessarily look hafu. I don't necessarily look mixed. I don't have the stereotypical look, I guess, is maybe what I could say. And so I have spent a fair amount of time trying to look and be perceived as being more Japanese than I might look otherwise. I did spend a chunk of time in Japan adjusting to the norms or standards meant for women, whether it was clothing or hair or speech style, mannerisms, how we walk, how we use our body language, for example. And I do remember there was one time that I was in a taxi and the taxi driver assumed that I was Japanese. At the time, that was a big win for me. And this person mentioned that he just thought I had colored my hair, or he thought I was using contact lenses to change the color of my eyes or something. So that felt like a big win for me. But there were also a number of other experiences where I might make a phone call to a restaurant, for example, to make a reservation. I give them my last name, which is a Japanese last name. I show up and they become incredibly confused because they were not expecting someone to look like me after our phone conversation that we had either earlier in the day or earlier in the week. There were also a few other times that I experienced, and this isn't necessarily a sort of hafu or biracial thing, but people would hear my Japanese and realize I had no accent, and they would assume that I understood more things about Japanese culture or life in Japan as an adult that I really did understand. So there were some people who became upset, confused, or frustrated because there were things that I did not know that they assumed I should know. So it's a bit of an interesting thing. I think that growing up in Canada has allowed me to see a much wider variety of what it means to be a cisgender woman. And there's a lot more ways to express and embody that than there is to be a cisgender woman within Japan and Japanese society. So I did struggle with it a little bit, trying to find that balance of appearing more Japanese, being treated as Japanese, but also realizing that wasn't fully who and what I was based on my genetic background, where I grew up, and my ideas of how to present gender.
Those expectations that come, the assumptions based on hearing you're Japanese and you must understand the culture. And I think it's not something necessarily unique to Japan. Assumptions based on language, based on visible identifiers, things that we can see. So therefore, the values must be shared. And I think that happens to some extent in Canada as well, although because of the greater acceptance of diversity, I think that's starting to change, particularly in cities like Toronto. One thing that I'd heard, and granted, these were from people who didn't have Japanese in their background, talked about being able to leverage the fact that they were not Japanese to their advantage in certain situations. There's some crude examples of just being rough about it, but being able, for example, in a business situation, being able to speak up, whereas if you're considered Japanese, that wouldn't be acceptable, and being able to do those kinds of things. So I'm curious, was there a point where you possibly did a switch around, or were you able to use being a bicultural and maybe the Canadian side of things in certain situations to your advantage, or was that something that crossed your mind?
Yeah, definitely. It crossed my mind multiple times, and there were times when I would try to negotiate a sort of happy medium that might work for me, that wouldn't confuse some of the people around me, perhaps. There was a bit of a joke that I had with some of my friends, acquaintances in Japan, about pulling the gaijin card. So there were different things that we would do, or that I guess I would do specifically at times when I did not want to follow the expectations, what Japanese people were supposed to do in certain contexts. And so I don't have any examples that I can think of, but there were a few times when I would be a little bit more assertive, perhaps, or make slight adjustments in my behavior to show maybe people in a store, for example, that I did not feel like being very Japanese at the time, maybe like a don't talk to me kind of thing, or making a point of speaking only English with some of my friends. So there were a few things that I referred to as the gaijin card, but just as an FYI, I'm not a fan of the term gaijin. It should be gaikokujin. But at the time, it was a little bit easier, a little bit shorter to refer to it as well. But it was more the occasional episode. Right now, I don't feel like this kind of thing, rather than a lifestyle or a mindset shift that occurred long term, in my case.
So something to employ when you felt it was necessary. And sometimes you hear of people in bicultural situations that there's a bit of a struggle with identity. I had a guest, a younger woman, Japanese, but moved to the US just very shortly after and married an American, mentioned that she was struggling with her own identity because of some of the things that she felt from her exposure to the US. As you've gotten older, what do you have to say about negotiating identity, or anything else you might add about that?
Probably for most of my life, I think, where I spent a lot of my childhood, like I mentioned earlier, sort of fighting for the Japanese identity that I had. I have had a few sort of identity crises type things over the past whatever number of years. But my conclusion that I came to while I was in Japan, and this works for me, may not necessarily work for anyone else, but what I realized was that if I identify as Japanese, I cannot be Canadian. I cannot be anything else. But if I identify as Canadian, I can still be as Japanese as I want. So that was what I realized about myself. I still do very much hold on to the Japanese-ness and being Japanese, but that realization for me was very helpful to figure out how I could balance the two identities, the two cultures, the two languages, the two ways of living. But I do know that it can look very different for different people, and being exposed to different types of expectations, receiving different types of comments, maybe the type of people in your life, no matter where you are, all of these things can influence how you perceive yourself and how you want to present yourself to the world at different points of times in your life. It can take a while, but yeah, I just hope that, like me, other people can also figure out what works best for them and find that happy medium where they can be like, yeah, this is what I am and I'm cool with that. Nobody can take that away.
That was part one of the conversation with Sachi. And again, as I mentioned in the chat, I really appreciate the honesty that Sachi shared with some of the struggles that she'd faced with identity. And I think that that's something that's very valuable to let people know that you're not alone, because I think at different points, we all struggle with identity, and certainly those in circumstances where you are of two cultures or two races can really potentially confuse matters. So knowing that that's something that that others can go through, you're not alone. There are others you can talk to, and we'll touch a little bit more on that in the beginning of the next episode. But I wanted to just highlight a couple of the other comments that came up. Again, this was a very lively discussion. So some of the points that came up. There was a Benjamin who asked earlier about mentioned that he'd like to move to Osaka earlier, and had some great advice, particularly from Sachi, who mentioned the idea of joining an eikaiwa private language school could be an easy way. That's where I started as well, going through an eikaiwa private language school for English conversation, and certainly taking that route helped me. There are other means, of course, going more officially through the JET program to work directly in the public school system. So there are a number of ways to do that if you want to find that. And a number of great comments from others, like Anam, mentioning the idea of leveraging differences, cultural differences and similarities. When you have that understanding of different cultures, you can adjust as necessary. And I think in some ways playing the gaijin card might be a way of doing that in situations in Japan. And so there was the term that I also highlighted, a more crude way of it, using the gaijin card, gaijin smash, which I think is kind of thinking of it as the image of a bull in the china shop. So doing it in a very blatant way, maybe not necessarily the best way of handling cultural differences, but perhaps early on when you're experimenting with leveraging differences, that might be a way. But eventually developing skills where you can be a little more subtle about it, I think is an excellent skill to have. So thank you very much for all of the comments and interactivity that was going on in the episode here. And again, to Sachi as well. And of course, this is not the end, because we have part 2 coming up next week. So on Wednesday, April 19th, again at the usual time. So in this part, we will talk a little bit more about identity and being in a state of not knowing, and possibly some other useful advice that Sachi has for others who may be struggling with identity based on her own experiences. But we're going to get a lot more into the work that she does, particularly her work as a language educator and a translator, how she went about doing that, and particularly her work in translation to help, for example, Nikkei reconnect with their Japanese heritage, and being able to spread other information that maybe previously had been isolated in one language, and being able to spread it out to the world by translating from Japanese to English. And again, I think it's going to be a great, just as part 1 was great here. Really looking forward to sharing part 2. So in the meantime, between now and then, keep navigating your way between cultures towards your goals. We'll see you next week.